just to make sure that got it. Hey, hello everyone. It feels like I'm like this YouTube host saying, welcome back. We've just for another exciting lecture with Nick Foste, RDI. Nick is an incredible designer, design futurist, and I'm just going to take a moment to read his official biography to you because it's really amazing. So Nick is a designer, creative leader, and futurist based in California. He's worked at the intersection of technology and design with globally recognized organizations like Google, Sony, Nokia, and Dyson, and has established himself as a pioneering figure in the field of features design. In 2021, he was awarded the title Royal Designer for Industry in recognition for his significant contribution to this field, the highest accolade for a British designer. More recently, Nick served as the head of design at Google X, where he led a multidisciplinary team of researchers, strategists, and designers in the development of world-changing technology projects. He's known for his approachable, down-to-earth, and occasionally irreverent vision work, which explores everyday moments from emergent futures. For over a decade, Nick has also been a partner at the Near Future Laboratory, the seminal Futures Collective, which developed the practice of design fiction and published the Manual of Design Fiction in 2022. In addition to his professional pursuits, Nick dedicates significant time to education and advising. In 2020, he accepted an honorary role as visiting professor at the Royal College of Art in London. He's an advisor to the United Nations Development Programme, and he frequently lectures and tutors students at colleges and universities across Europe, Asia, and the USA. Born in Derby, a city renowned for its role in the Industrial Revolution and the development of the jet engine, Nick has twice been named Young Engineer for Britain by the British Engineering Council. In 2001, he received his master's degree fellow for the Royal Society of Arts. Nick moved to California in 2012, where he resides with his wife, Jane. And without any further ado, over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Well, it sounds long when you read it all out like that, doesn't it?
It's good. It's very good.
Thanks, Anna. Let me just share a screen. And you should be seeing that, right? A thumbs up from somebody. Yeah. Great.
Sorry, Nick, just before we go, so we've got an hour and the plan is maybe 30 to 40 minutes and then 20 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Cool. It's nice to be here. Thanks again for the introduction. And it sounds very formal, but I appreciate it. Nice to meet you all digitally. I hope to be there one day in person. And as I said, I'm in California where it's morning. I appreciate you giving up your evenings in Europe there. But as Anab said, I'm a designer and a futurist, and I want to spend some time today talking about how we collectively think about the future, and also explore my own evolving position on that and how we might do that, particularly in industry. So this, you should see that now, right? Timeline, good. This is my timeline of my employment and my sort of education over the years. And the reason I put that up there is not through any braggadocio. It's just to sort of say the kinds of work that I do. I've been really lucky to work for some of the most interesting technology companies on the planet, including Dyson in the early days. In sort of the late 90s, I joined their team. And then I spent some time with Sony, working between London and Japan, before moving into the advanced design team at Nokia, which is what brought me to the United States, and then at Google. And I've spent the entirety of my career basically helping companies think about the future and helping them explore the challenges they might face and the technologies that they might develop and the products that they might create. And most recently, for the last 8 years, I've been head of design at Google X. It's actually called X, but you're probably more familiar of it as Google X. And this is the CEO of that organization, Astro Teller. And X is where Alphabet tackles some of the world's biggest challenges. So where it applies emerging technologies and figures out ways to address some of those challenges. And it's probably best known for creating the self-driving vehicle. And the resulting company that came out of that research work, Waymo, was one of the first graduates of X in 2016. At X, they also used high-altitude balloons to bring network connectivity to remote places under connected parts of the world with Project Loon. This was one of the first projects that I worked on. I was fortunate enough to go to Peru and see some of these things in the flesh. Now, I'm 47 years old, which is quite old, but the population of Earth has doubled since I was born. which is sort of a staggering thing. Since that Adele song, Rolling in the Deep, was #1, we've added 1 billion people to the planet. One of the main stresses that brings upon the planet is the demand for food. And we're going to really need to fundamentally change the way we grow things and what we grow. And I think global agriculture is going to need to produce more food in the next 50 years than it has in the previous 10,000. So in response to that challenge, this was a project that X kicked off called Project Mineral, which is trying to investigate computational agriculture. How can we bring the emerging computation and automation technologies that we have access to into the role of agriculture? And then finally, X also tried to attempt to tackle the hardest part of the robot problem, which is unstructured human spaces. This was the Everyday Robots project. So that's sort of a bit of a taste of the kinds of things that I've been doing for the last couple of decades, but most recently the last 8 years at X. So I spent a great deal of time actually thinking about the future. And I think over time I've developed some fairly strong opinions about how we do that in industry. And I want to make it really clear that I'm very much on the sort of commercial applied end of futures design. I spend my time working with people who have the will and the means to define the future at scale, to actually do it, not to discuss it or build theories or think about it, but to actually start making those inroads into the future. And, you know, I'm talking to you today as students, and I think academia is actually doing a really solid job at the forefront of contemporary futures design. I'm really, really genuinely excited that there are more universities and colleges and courses exploring the role of design in developing our kind of collective notions of the future and pushing us forward and provoking us and helping us think differently. That's a really strong role, and I think actually academia is doing a pretty good job of it. But within industry, and actually particularly within broad culture, I think we face a really big challenge, a really significant challenge when it comes to thinking about the future. And that's the thing I really want to talk about today. So at the beginning, I was introduced, and I actually introduced myself as a futurist. And in truth, it's a title that I'm not very comfortable with, and I've only just recently started to feel a little more comfortable with it, and I'm trying it on, I suppose. It's not a title that I wear very well, mostly because of what I think it says about me. And I think it has something to do with this, the word futuristic. And when I say futuristic, I think we have a collective cultural problem. I think industry and society and culture is still stuck with this word. And this word represents something that I really just don't want to be associated with. And I've done this little sort of parlor trick with people and audiences and talks in the past. When you ask people to close their eyes for a second and think of the word futuristic, what do you think people see? Now, I think I've got a pretty good idea, and it's proven to be quite true over the years. It's things like this: sort of smooth, seamless, exotic forms, strange colors, unusual materials, things like that. Or maybe if somebody's more interested in sort of computation and electronics, they think of magical devices, like this world bristling and brimming with sensors, delivering these incredible insights, these sort of fundamental shifts in the way that we interact with the world around us. Or if they come from a sort of more urban background, maybe they think of fantastic cities, towering, curiously shaped architecture, you know, skyscrapers built from glass and steel, looming overhead with these sort of lightning fast monorails and hovering passenger drones. And quite often they'll think about things like the future of work, you know, the future of work, the future of work. We hear it all the time. And you see these people sort of wafting at virtual things, like rotating these 3D objects in space. And it's a world of kind of glowing, flickering blue wireframes. And, you know, I'm deliberately picking things to make my point here, but I'm a sample of one. If we do a much broader sample and ask Google what futuristic or the future looks like, it thinks it's this. So this is a Google image search for the word, like, what does the future look like, or what is the future, or futuristic? You can try it yourself. And what we see is it's a remarkably monocultural space. It's sort of fascinating to me that in the present, we can have immensely complicated and nuanced discussions about everything from football to cut flowers. But when it comes to thinking about the future or futuristic things, it's kind of staggering how narrow and uniform and homogeneous and repetitive that work is. It's all the same things: towering cities, sweeping white environments, these bipedal robots, holograms, virtual worlds, and it's all lit in purple and blue. For some reason, the future is purple and blue. So over the last 25 years of being immersed in this sort of commercial futures world, surrounded by other designers, other researchers, other engineers and scientists, and actually other futurists, I've come to a position that I'm very comfortable sharing with you today, which is I think our collective imagination about the future has been hopelessly and unhelpfully colonized by science fiction. And it results in an environment that I don't want to be a part of, which is why I wear the title futurist really poorly. And it's an environment that I think is escapist. It's an environment dominated by sort of these sort of abstract expressions of ambition. And the function of these things is actually just to be rolled out at trade shows or to be eye candy for shareholders. We see them at CES, you know, they're all over the internet. They're thirst traps for clicks, this sort of never-ending quest for eyeballs and keep looking at our brand. And more often than not, pieces of work like this are actually funded by branding and marketing teams, not technology teams, not new product development or engineering teams. It's also a world that I think is really repetitive. The same concepts just get rejigged year after year after year. And science fiction cinema cements those things into our collective conscience, and we just sort of can't see past them. They become this seemingly inevitable reality. And you can see it in the adjectives we've used over the decades. Throughout the years, we see these same things coming: atomic, robotic, flying, gestural, virtual, generative. They just become these sort of themes that we rejig time after time after time. Finally, it's a world of fantasy. It's a world where you see images like this. And to me, these are pornography. They're just designed to provoke some purely visceral, emotional response to the pixels that are being, you know, fired at your retinas. And it doesn't help us in any way. It's really difficult to act upon because it doesn't show a transition state from where we are in the present. It doesn't even acknowledge the present. It treats the future as this sort of abstract conceit rather than an evolution or a response to the present. And I'll be really honest with you, I spent the early part of my career producing things like this. I thought this is what I was supposed to do as a commercial futurist. It was really good fun, actually. It was exciting, it was engaging. I was playing with new technologies and pushing and having fun playing with shapes and playing with forms. But over time, honestly, I've become really disillusioned in that work. And I think it's a really weak thing to do, because throughout all of that time, I just couldn't escape this. And this is the house where I grew up. I think you had James Auger on a few weeks ago, and we were actually born in the same town. But this is where I was born, and I spent the early part of my life in that top left window playing with Lego. And it's, you know, it's an ordinary house. It's as ordinary and everyday as imaginable. You know, houses like this are probably familiar to most of you on this call. You know, I don't live there anymore, but somebody does. And I'm always just curious, like, what's the future like for them? What's the future like for people living in this house today? Why can't we build futures that feel like an evolution of this place? You know, the futures work that dominates my world, it just never feels like it's in any way attached to this world that I'm showing you now. And I've been trying to focus the more recent part of my career on addressing that gap. Now, of course, you know, I ragged on science fiction, and obviously I'm being very broad with my definition of science fiction. And in my industry, it's actually sort of heretical to criticize science fiction. It's such a dominant thing in our creative society. In commercial futures, science fiction and futures just go together like this. And of course, in the right hands, you know, science fiction can be really powerful, and it can help us think about the possibilities of technologies and changes in society. And it helps us, actually, what it's really good at, or can be really good at, is thinking about the societal implications and the human level implications of technologies. And folks like Isaac Asimov here have definitely helped to shape the ways in which we think about technology and its relationship to culture and society and all those things. Some of my colleagues have also used science fiction quite well in the work that they do to good effect. But we really have to acknowledge that science fiction is entertainment. It has a duty to engage its reader or its viewer, and it has to follow narrative conventions and structures and constraints. Science fiction isn't a pitch. You know, it's not a strategy. It's not like a balanced proposition. And when we're using science fiction as an influence for a futures project, you know, or a thing that we're about to start doing, a real significant level of abstraction is needed. You need to interpret the work. You need to have a level of pragmatism over the top of it. And honestly, from my perspective, that work just isn't being done. So over the years, I've been trying to develop my own approach to tackling this and trying to create these more grounded, rational, actionable futures in the work that I do. I work in a very technocratic environment. I have a bias for that. but I want to try and find ways that really make it grokkable and allow people to get their hooks into it and understand it and play with it. So I've built this thing. I loosely call it a manifesto, but I'm not sure if it is a manifesto. These are just 3 pointers that I've used in my career that I hope might be useful to some of you if you go into this part of the world of futures. And it's essentially just, 3 pillars, 3 ways of thinking that can help direct your thinking towards more relevant, insightful, and hopefully more actionable futures. So, dramatic pause while I drink. The first one of 3 is that the future mundane is filled with background talent. Now, background talent is a term from the movie industry, and in different industries, they're known as different things like extras or supernumeraries or non-playable characters or the chorus. But basically what I'm trying to say is in the future, as with the present, the majority of people will be in the background. So let's dig into this a bit. When we do any futures project, we're essentially doing a piece of storytelling because the future doesn't exist yet. We have no manifest reality. We have to tell a story about the future. And when we tell stories, we tend to fall back on the standard tropes and formats of stories. And one of the narrative habits that we fall back into all the time is the trope of the hero. You know, heroes are really useful ways of telling stories. They're good conduits for telling a story. They give us something to hold on to as the story plays out. And every generation has had its heroes, nearly always men. But from the ancient Greeks to the Norse gods to the Romans into contemporary entertainment, you know, the hero, they go through some sort of epic hardship. You know, they follow their story arc, they overcome some extreme complication, and then they emerge victorious at the end. And that pattern really carries through into the vast majority of commercial futures work. If we look at it, these are the kinds of images we see in commercial futures work. And these are apex people having apex experiences with apex products. It's everywhere. You know, without a doubt, commercial futures work is heroic. But when we really interrogate this stuff, you know, heroes by definition lead extraordinary lives. This is a bit silly, but these are the synopses of the last 11 Tom Cruise movies, who's a contemporary hero of choice. And they by definition lead extraordinary lives. They find themselves in extraordinary situations. They need these extraordinary stories, actually, in order for us to remain engaged. There's no film, there's no book, there's no story where Tom Cruise needs to find a part for a lawnmower, or to sort out a spreadsheet formula, or to help his kids with his homework, or refill his propane tanks. Those are not things that happen to Tom Cruise. And no matter what we've been told from reality TV or motivational coaches or the century of the self, we're not special. We are all ordinary. We're an extra, we're a piece of background talent. And the truth is, so are all of our customers. The future is going to be a world of routines, of ordinary lives, of regular experiences. If we plot a bell curve of populations, the reason it's shaped like a bell curve is everybody's in the middle. So when we look at science fiction cinema, or we look at telling stories about the future, or we start a futures design project, it's really tempting to think about this heroic character in the foreground. We focus on these kind of extreme, outlandish, almost always escapist characters, and it deeply affects the kind of futures that we draw. And I keep saying this, and I've said this in meetings, Tony Stark is not your user. You know, his needs are sort of irrelevant to you if you're creating a product for a mass market. He represents a market of one at the very best. So if you're looking at a scene like this, it's much more interesting to focus on, say, the elderly lady who might live here. You know, it might be more honest and more interesting and actually more useful to consider her needs. Where does she buy milk? How much is her rent? You know, is she still arguing with her neighbor? You know, that's the first pillar. That's the first thing I want to focus on. The future mundane is filled with background talent. I'm going to take a small diversion here and talk a little bit about design fiction, because I want to show practically the kinds of things I've done to help situate this kind of way of thinking. So I work in a medium called design fiction quite often, and I recently co-wrote this book, which is unfortunately fully out of print, but we do have a paperback edition coming imminently. So design fiction is basically an approach which allows us to live in a future for a moment, to really experience it. And I found it's a way to help really ground projects and give you something around which you can have a real conversation, to develop questions around an emerging technology, and actually how that emerging technology might leak into these ordinary everyday lives that I keep talking about. It looks a bit like this. It's often manifest in a physical thing. And what it does is it allows us to live, like I said, in that world for a second. It's like production design in a movie. When you design the inside of a building, like set the context around which your story is going to sell. So whenever a conversation is getting too vague or too hand wavy or whatever, it's really useful to create a few pieces of this kind of stuff, just to say, this is the world in which our user and our customer might be living. And I want to be clear, this is not a project about, in this case, designing breakfast cereal. If we're designing a future piece of virtual reality or a robot or something, just before the person interacts with that thing, they may well have just had breakfast. So setting that context for that person, building out their narrative, building out their normalcy really helps you understand how they're going to approach this whiz-bang new piece of technology around which we might be talking. I also really like thinking about how things that are really fantastic will become trash. How will things just be value engineered down to the dollar store? When we're talking about, things like nutraceuticals or artificially improved foodstuffs, for example, it's very easy to get super lofty and think about, a white laboratory with amazing pills that you eat. But the truth is, if that becomes a really big part of society, it'll become white noise. It'll become stuff that you just see in the gutter in the morning underneath the trash. It's been a really potent approach for me when working with sort of scientists and engineers to say, actually, this is great. And if we want this to be a mass adopted thing, this will be the kind of way it'll show up. So there's just a couple of quick design fiction slides, and I'll return to it a bit as I talk more through these pillars. So the second pillar is that the future mundane is accretive. Now, accretive is just a fancy way of saying stuff just piles up over time. And when we see future concepts and presentations, they regularly look something like this. And obviously, you're all very smart designers here, but your smart designer should step in and say, where did all the old stuff go? Was there just some big clear out, some government mandated order to empty out all those kitchen drawers? Everything got purged and burnt just before this vision was built. And there's a term that my colleague Christian Irwin introduced me to, Gesamtkunstwerk, which is a term used in typically in architecture, which is this like total work of art. When people propose things in the future, we tend to assume that we're in total control of the totality of its existence. And we sort of rarely consider anything external. You're familiar with seeing things like this, renderings of skyscrapers with all of the other buildings just grayed out, like they don't matter, like they don't exist or won't play an integral role in how that new building will function and interplay with its environment and society. Because the truth is, the present looks something like this. Look at my room. It's full of stuff. The world is full of stuff, and we don't have any evidence to suggest that the future will be anything other than this. Humans are sentimental beings. We keep hold of things. We inherit things. We look after things for people. Not only that, but things mature at different speeds. Modern technology is on quite a fast cadence. If you're familiar with the notion of pace layers, things move very quickly inside of things that move much slower. So we might be designing a VR headset or whatever, some very futuristic thing, but the user takes that off and they put it down, and it might be stored on top of a set of 20th century drawers, and they might be sat on top of a 1960s rug in a 1920s house. The future just builds up on top of itself. It's also important to acknowledge the phenomenon that over time, technology becomes stuff, becomes this white noise again. It just normalizes. Very quickly, we all know this, right? When we buy a new piece of technology, it's very amazing and we keep it very clean and we look after it and we're showing it to friends. And then very, very quickly, it's sort of in our pocket and in our bag. And very, very quickly after that, it's in the kitchen drawer or it's been handed down to a nephew or something. Technology over time becomes stuff and it blends into the everyday. And again, the future will be almost the same. But again, in my world, when we see images of the future, they sort of look like this. And they're not inherently bad, there's no direct critique of this particular idea, but it's hard for me to do anything with this. They're just sitting alone as a rendering in this sort of non-contextual Cornell box. There's no license plate, no parking permits, no people, no other vehicles, no bicycles, no roads, no weather. There's just nothing. I'm just left with this sort of abstract notion of form and maybe materials. And I can kind of thumbs up and say, it looks like a nice shape. It doesn't really help me understand the world. And no more so is this more prevalent than in connected devices. All software and all services are built on top of countless other systems, interaction norms, infrastructures, your Google logins, PayPal, dominant operating systems, all that stuff. Yet when we have pitched software and services from the future, they tend to look something like this. If we think about something kind of simple like this product, the Amazon Echo, it's a relatively affordable device, it's highly simplified in its interaction. You just sort of yell at it and it yells something back. Such to the point where it's sort of almost an invisible interaction to most people. Hey, Alexa, what's the time? It tells you the time and we're done. But there's this really lovely project that I'm sure many of you are familiar with by Kate Crawford from 2018, which is the Anatomy of an AI System, where she tried to map all of the things going on with that simple invocation, that fleeting moment of interaction that you just yell something at this box, all of the other systems, the interlaced chains of dependency, all the algorithmic processing software, all the networks that are being invoked, all the prediction and optimization technologies, all the software norms and all of the user data management norms. The scale of this system actually is beyond human imagining. It's so vast and so big, sort of the result of decades and decades of technology just piling upon itself. And again, design fiction is really, really helpful in doing this. So if you think of something simple like I hope you can see this image well, it's probably quite small text for you, but think of something as humble as like a receipt for a meal, a date that a couple of people have been on. It's such an almost invisible piece of ephemera that we're all very familiar with. But then if we think about that as something like a piece of evidence in a murder case, if we really start picking apart forensically, like what we're seeing in this, we see a rich tale of these interwoven things, hundreds of little signals about the way the world works, people's habits, the decisions and societal norms that people have made and what was prevalent at the time. Something like a receipt, I love using things like this because they take a half hour to produce and a half hour to photograph, but you can tell all these different stories, all these different elemental pieces all start to come together, stories about how people got there, stories about the kinds of food they eat, the way that their society works, how privacy is important or not, things moving at different paces, some things remaining the same and some things spiking and being very important at a certain time. I really love design fiction for this because it's very quick and you can produce all these things together and help teams and help partners and help other people you're working with understand that the thing that we want to affect and the thing that we want to develop is going to play on a field with many, many hundreds of other things. So that's the second pillar of the future mundane, is that it's accretive. The third part, the future mundane is a bit broken. So as designers, I'm a designer. I'm assuming people on this call are mostly designers. I think design is like an inherently optimistic endeavor. More generally, when we're talking about the future, we tend towards the better, whatever that is, even though that sets off a few alarms for me. Like that's sort of what we're trying to do, some version of up and to the right. But I think generally, particularly in my world, we get very carried away. We start to drift towards utopia. And there's a quote here from Morrissey, who's a great lyricist and a kind of questionable human being, but a really great quote here, which is, every day I play a sad game called In the Future When All's Well. And I think we have this notion about the future that in the future all's well. It's sort of this impossible place of perfection, this sort of myth of utopianism, this world of seamlessness and purity. But honestly, I'm firmly in the belief that the quest for utopia is a fruitless one. Because again, look at the present. The present is full of failure and breakage and damage. It's just an inherent part of the grain of how we live on Earth. And if our aim is to make more vivid stories about the future and really engage with the future with rigor, we should acknowledge that it will be a bit broken. The future is undoubtedly going to be filled with little moments like this. And there's a lot of good quotes in this field, but one that I really like is from the French cultural theorist Paul Virilio, which is the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. There were no shipwrecks before the ship was invented. And I found it really useful in my career to think about these things and not get like romanced by a new piece of technology or a new invention. Because when we introduce something like USB-C, we also introduced dongles. The creation of one was the creation of the other. My smartwatch, which is sat down here somewhere, it can do amazing things, but now my smartwatch comes with a password that I'm required to remember. We live in a world of patches and workarounds and temporary fixes. We live in a world of the half dog. So panoramic stitching, when you take your phone and you do this thing, it's a very complicated thing to do algorithmically. but we've accepted it into our lives, and it's part and parcel of going on holiday, going on a beach and those kinds of things. But when something moves very fast through the frame, like a dog in this case, the algorithm can't quite stitch it together. So it stitches it together poorly, and we get the half dog. So now it's somebody's job to go in there and figure that out and try and fix that. It's something we never struggled with before. We didn't struggle with the half dog before we had panoramic stitching. You know, connected doorbells, for example, they can help us with lots of micro problems. They can help us see when we have a package, or see when somebody's at the front door, or we can even talk to them through some of these products. But now they live precipitously on the edge of connectivity networks. We need to acknowledge these things. We need to acknowledge and make sense of the complexity and volatility and the messiness of the world. You know, we should try and play with the hand of cards that we've been dealt, rather than ask for some new cards. And it's very trendy in my world to talk about solutions. But whenever I hear that word, it sort of sets off my little internal alarm. And I'm increasingly of the position that I don't think we ever truly solve anything, or entirely solve anything. We either improve it a little, or we punt the problem down the road for some time, or punt it more often into somebody else's yard, or we break it down into smaller, more manageable parts, or we introduce new problems. But I don't think we actually ever just sort of eradicate something entirely. The way that we introduce things into the world is done so through an accretive manner. You know, stuff happens when we introduce something new. And actually, in the industries that shape our future, from the technology companies I'm familiar with to investment and venture businesses or public policy, I think we've developed an overriding culture of toxic positivity. It's really, really difficult to talk about the implications of new ideas in industry. I think in academia, this is where you do amazing work. And when I was at the Royal College of Art, thinking about implications and thinking about negativity and thinking about, you know, unintended consequences is part and parcel of what we do. In industry, it's really, really hard. It takes immense bravery to introduce that kind of negativity or uncertainty into a conversation. And because it's hard, I don't think it happens enough. I think it's a symptom of the internal cultures of organizations where an idea needs to be pitched, even to your colleagues, not just to the customer or through marketing, but to your colleagues, rather than proposing an idea and then being open to critiquing it. You know, it's all about winning people over and building mind share and scoring that deal or getting that investment. And I think it's a really big miss. It leads to a world, like I said, of solution-minded people, of toxic positivity. And it's something that I've been trying to address with, you know, some success over the last 10 years. Again, design fiction can do a really good job here. We can produce these things very quickly. It's a quick way to sort of set a scene, to sort of show how, yes, we're talking about this thing and it's really interesting, but have you thought about how it might lead to this, or this might happen? And, you know, something like this is a very quick thing to produce. You can start to have that really nuanced conversation about how something might be a little bit wrong, or it might just work in a way that you hadn't intended. How people might circumvent what we're introducing or find workarounds to a proposal, how sort of new weird economies might spring up, or how people might misuse things. It's actually just really good business too, because if you can see into areas where your product might not work very well, or it might introduce new complicated things, you can either work to avert them or introduce new ideas and get ahead of a new problem earlier than your competitors. So little pieces of media like this can be occasionally really powerful, and using the tools of design to facilitate a detailed and more nuanced conversation is I think is an amazing skill that we have, allowing teams to sort of explore the full impact of what they're talking about and give them something around which to have a conversation. So that's the Future Mundane. It's my own thing. You're welcome to use it if you find it useful. But the first is it's filled with background talent. Everybody is an extra. Everyone's going to lead a fairly ordinary, normal life. Let's stop focusing on heroes. The second is that it's an accretive space. Stuff just piles up over time, technology with culture, with society, with objects. And the third is that it's a bit broken. Things won't work perfectly all the time. Breakage and damage and workarounds and failures and faults are part of our life. So let's include them in our visions about the future. So that's what I have. I really appreciate the time today. Thank you to Anab and for all of you. I've deliberately left a bit of space for questions if you have any. If you want to reach out and you're not happy asking questions in a big audience, that's fine. Just reach out on Twitter or wherever. But yeah, that's what I have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you. Really beautiful and so relevant to all the work we're doing as well, trying to think of stories and craft stories in a way that are not hero-led, and just good to see in practice. how you work. And also, I think really important for you to bring this commercial perspective, because it is really important to see that there are really significant, if you choose to go down the route of working for organizations and businesses, there are many opportunities for you to do so. So absolutely useful for the students. I'm going to open it up for questions, thoughts, comments, reflections.
I would have a question. Hey, thank you for the concept of the future mundane. It's really nice. It's nice to hear about it. And I wondered about, because you nicely critiqued the way of like how commercials do it right now, the aesthetics. What's your aesthetics you would go for if it's not that polished, high look, set in a white cube? What kind of aesthetics would you go for if you have a project that is similar than it's done by the other companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in creating a product or a service or a system for the future, it has to be, you have to target it in very many different ways. So within an organization, there's a certain way you need to talk about a project. And then when it gets out into the wider world, how you talk about it to customers or clients or consumers, to use that terminology. And therefore the imagery and the way that you communicate that should change accordingly. I guess my main thing is try to include some level of context in everything you create. So rendering software particularly, I was talking to Tobias Rebel about this. You know, whenever you open up a piece of rendering software, which from my world, I'm an industrial designer by training, so I'm more of a man of objects, you know. And when we open up these pieces of software like CAD and rendering softwares, we're given an infinite white box. You know, that's what we're given to start with. So we drop our thing into it and we just sort of look at it like it was on a plinth in a gallery. And I've been desperately trying to find an image that stuck in my brain from decades ago. There was an agency who developed some tools for mechanics, some hand tools, spanners and wrenches and things like that. And instead of showing them sort of hovering in zero gravity on a white background, they made models and they put them in, you know, a toolbox, toolkit. With little bits of tape on and bits of grease on and underneath screwdrivers and everything. It just felt like, this is the kind of product rendering I've wanted to see for my whole life, because this is how these things will exist. For that second that they're in the store, they might look a bit like that, but the way you're going to interact with this product for your whole life, and you know, a spanner could be 20 years easily. Like, let's show them in that context. And it takes an awful lot more work to produce that kind of rendering, and the world is not used to seeing that kind of rendering. But I want to sort of find a way that we can encourage people to show these things in parallel with the other things around which they're going to live. So if I was ever to reach out and create images of things in the real world, that's the kind of world I would like to see more of. So yeah, in communicating an idea of something, let's try and show it in context wherever possible. I think that's my perspective. The thing itself can be fantastical and using amazing materials and whatever else. You know, it has to be a contemporary object. But it's going to live in this room or in somebody's glove box or in somebody's kitchen or in somebody's drawer. So let's try and show that a bit more.
Who else would like? Anyone else would like to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Working in the American culture and startup culture, and you talked about toxic positivity. How is the reaction if you come with even that statement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hear some stink on your question about a difference between an American culture and a European culture. We could dig into that one. I don't know if they're vastly different, actually. It might be a symptom of the size of the organizations within which I'm familiar. You know, I've worked in large, multi-thousand person organizations for a long time. And as such, you're often interacting with people that you don't know personally. And so it's harder to have frank and relevant conversations with people in that kind of culture. So you find yourself sort of trying to win people over and sell them. And that's not a place where you come in and say, hey, there's this great thing we've been working on. Let me show you all the ways it's going to be really difficult, all the ways it might break, or all the ways it's not going to be great for society. That's a difficult thing to do. But I think smart organizations will find ways to allow people to have those kind of conversations. And there are sort of different hat wearing techniques that people have tried in sort of software, particularly where people come in and try and use it as a hacking tool or try to think of the negative externalities. And I think you just have to build it into a culture. You have to say from the very top, like, let's cut this out. No one's trying to sell anything to each other. Let's assume everyone's trying to make the best thing. Let's just start there. But I want everyone to have a slide in their deck, let's say, at the end, which just says, these are the things I'm really uncertain about. These are the things that we've discussed that could be a bit wonky and I'm not sure. Like, try and build that into a culture. I don't think that culture exists just yet. And I think we are still in a culture of trying to sell ideas internally and trying to win people over and build momentum, which sort of willfully sometimes can obfuscate like complicated conversations. But the truth is, it just makes them more complicated. Because if you do release something like that at mass to millions of people, those sort of unintended consequences and the things you might have been putting off or ignoring, they come up really vividly and, you know, violently, and you have to deal with them then quickly. So I think it's just good business to do that kind of negative externalities work and try and find ways in your culture to integrate it and ways you can do it without it feeling personal or without it being like detrimental to your own progress or your own career. But it does require a cultural shift. And like I said, I don't know if it's that much different in Europe or the US, actually. I think it is something to do with working in ever more connected systems where you need 1,000 people to come together to bring something to market. You're just working with people you don't know, so you end up sort of switching into selling mode, you know.
Thank you.
Question. Oh,
There's another one.
yeah. Toby.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you a bit about like your more practical workflow and how you approach a project. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very open-ended question. Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm familiar with working in areas where technology is kind of nascent and just starting. And what you often find is like, it would be lovely to say, we're going to do all this research into this technology or this shift in society or a new way that's happening. And then we're going to do all of the design investigations work. And then we're going to set out like, these are the big challenges, or this is the shape of a new product, and then start doing the work. What you actually find is that people just start doing. They just start making things or releasing things or producing things or doing their own research. And it's often based off I mean, I'm not going to use the term bias with a lot of like anger, but people approach a problem space or an idea for a new product with their own biases based on the way they see the world or the things they've experienced. So quite often I'd be working with teams who are sort of not halfway through, but well into making something or had an idea and they just started to build it. So a lot of the work that I've done in the past with the teams I've worked with is to just take a step back, talk to them all, try and figure out the grain in the technology, try to figure out actually what is the thing that you're excited about, zoom out a bit, start to think about all of the other spectra where that can be applied or the types of things that could be more interesting, and then play that back to the team that are working on the thing and say, I appreciate you're working in that way, and I appreciate that that's exciting for you right now, but there's a whole thing you might be missing over here. And try and sort of have that conversation to show them the breadth of opportunity, and also, you know, bring in some of the complications and just try and get plain statements all the way through the project. And then hopefully maybe steer the project a little bit towards more fruitful territories or more interesting areas, or areas where the new technology could have more impact or change the world in a more interesting way. So it's often jumping into some river as it's already flowing and trying to listen to people and understand why they're excited, and then try to zoom back with our own team and just sort of set the landscape around them and build the kind of plane as it's flying, and then come back and say, actually, we should steer it over here a little bit. So it's a lot of sort of back and forth and negotiation. It's very rarely kind of, you know, I have a strong railing against process-oriented design, you know, the sort of procedural design thinking kind of models and things. I just don't think the world works in that linear way almost ever, certainly not the world I'm familiar with. You have to sort of start in the middle, go back a bit, rethink it, change it a bit, learn something from prototyping. You know, it's very sort of turbulent, I guess.
Thank you, Nick. I think that was a great question to be asked, because I want to dig again a bit more into it in terms of your own process. If you have a question you're wrangling and exploring, how do you think? Do you think through sketching, prototyping, building, making, reading, research, a bit of all of them? What's the iterative, discursive process, not a linear one? about the
Yeah,
experimental one?
it's definitely all of them, and but I have a bias towards like just make something. Like I when I was tutoring a bit at the Royal College, a lot of the students there would have reams and reams of reading and research, and this artist did this interesting thing, and this book's really interesting, and I really like this thing. And it's like, okay, so what are you going to produce? What is the artifact? What is the product? What is the sort of thing you're headed towards? And they're like, well, I'm not sure yet. I was like, well, make something, anything, a little film, a little object or something, a chair or something that reflects on where you are right now. And you'll find that in the doing of that thing, you'll make a leap and say, actually, that's not what I'm interested in. This is what I'm interested in. So I think getting in quickly, building a prototype of something, building some, I mean, I think through objects, so it's probably a bias of mine, but I find that producing something, even if you're not sure yet, or you haven't quite finished your research or whatever, just make something and keep that on your desk and keep that in the group of people you're working with. And then you've got something around which you can talk. And actually having something, like a lot of the work that we did at X was actually putting things out there to say, well, not this. You're like, let's make something, and like at least we can agree where the bits that we don't like. At least we can point at the bits and say, I don't like that bit. That bit feels weird. So it's not about creating the ultimate opus masterpiece first. It's about creating something and saying, well, this bit's kind of nice, and I kind of understand that part of what you're trying to say, but this is the part where I think you're way off. So yeah, I have a bias towards, I sketch all the time. I always have paper on the table, but I like to make things, like physical things that can sit there as sort of totemic MacGuffins that just sort of sit in the corner of your peripheral vision and help you think a bit more. So yeah, I'm a tangible person.
And that's also, thank you, because that's also very much the kind of foundations of the course. We have a history of industrial design. We like materials and prototyping and aesthetics and sketching, but sometimes there is this kind of struggle to take that leap. Do you have any sort of tips when you struggle to make that leap?
I don't know if I've got tips other than just encouragement, really. Like, it's also like a lot of what we're doing as designers in this kind of space is communicating. And if, for example, you're just stuck in Miro or stuck in a document or stuck in PDF land, it'll only ever have that kind of impact for the people that can consume that stuff well. Like some people consume things very well through writing, and they find that a really lovely way to absorb. I think the vast majority of people need multimodal ways of being communicated to. They need to watch films, they need to see objects, they need to be in immersive experiences, they need to read, So if you're going to get your ideas across about the future, then trying to do that through many different ways is the best way, because you're going to appeal to more and more people. And somebody might see something in a little movie you make that they hadn't seen in any of the 10,000 words you've written. And I think that's important for me, is that we live in such a wonderful time as creative people that we have access to incredible tools that were hundreds of thousands of dollars when I was a student, that you can now just grab a camera and make a movie and spread it around the world, or you can produce something in a 3D printer or a workshop or whatever. Like, we have access to these tools, like just use them. Like, there's so many opportunities, which is why I sort of struggle by calling myself an industrial designer now, because I understand a bit about software, I understand a bit about services, I understand a bit about how to build a business, I understand about hardware, all this stuff. And I feel like I kind of design in all of it through all different media, sort of post-disciplinary, I suppose. So yeah, we have access. So just try as many different media as you can, and it'll appeal to more people.
That's a great message. I can see some smiles in the room. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts for Nick? No? Well, that's fine. I think this has been really, really useful and valuable, Nick. It's exactly what we wanted to hear at this time in the semester as well. We're big fans of your work and very much looking forward to what you do next.
But that's very sweet of you, and I appreciate being invited, and sort of jealous of where you are and where you are in your careers as well. So yeah, if anyone wants to talk to me some more, then honestly, please reach out. It's a great privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Take care.